The First Crusade was the first of a number of crusades that attempted to capture the Holy Lands, called by Pope Urban II in 1095. It started as a widespread pilgrimage in Western Christendom and ended as a military expedition by Roman Catholic Europe to regain the Holy Lands, taken in the Muslim conquest of the Levant, ultimately resulting in the recapture of Jerusalem in 1099. It was launched on 27 November 1095 by Pope Urban II with the primary goal of responding to an appeal from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who requested that Western volunteers come to his aid and help to repel the invading Seljuk Turks from Anatolia. An additional goal soon became the principal objective, the Christian reconquest of the sacred city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land and the freeing of the Eastern Christians from Muslim rule. During the Crusade, knights, peasants and serfs from many nations of Western Europe traveled over land and by sea, first to Constantinople, and then on towards Jerusalem. The Crusaders arrived at Jerusalem, launched an assault on the city, and captured it in July 1099, massacring many of the city's Muslim, Christian, and Jewish inhabitants. They also established the Crusader states of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. The First Crusade was followed by the Second to the Ninth Crusades. It was also the first major step towards reopening international trade in the West since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Because the First Crusade was largely concerned with Jerusalem, a city which had not been under Christian dominion for 461 years, and the Crusader army had refused to return the land to the control of the Byzantine Empire. The status of the First Crusade as defensive or as aggressive in nature remains controversial. Origin. The origin of the Crusades in general, and particularly that of the First Crusade, is widely debated among historians. The Crusades are most commonly linked to the political and social situation in 11th century Europe, the rise of a reform movement within the papacy, and the political and religious confrontation of Christianity and Islam in Europe and the Middle East. Christianity had spread throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East in late antiquity, but by the early 8th century Christian rule had become limited to Europe and Anatolia after the Muslim conquests. The Umayyad Caliphate had conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa from the predominantly Christian Byzantine Empire, and Hispania from the Visigothic kingdom. In North Africa, the Umayyad Empire eventually collapsed and a number of smaller Muslim kingdoms emerged, such as the Aghlabids, who attacked Italy in the 9th century. Pisa, Genoa, and the Principality of Catalonia began to battle various Muslim kingdoms for control of the Mediterranean basin, exemplified by the Mahdia campaign and battles at Majorca and Sardinia. Essentially, between the years 1096 and 1101 the Byzantine Greeks experienced the Crusade as it arrived at Constantinople in three separate waves. In the early summer of 1096, the first large unruly group arrived on the outskirts of Constantinople. This wave was reported to be undisciplined and ill-equipped as an army as noted in the People's Crusade. This first group is often called the Peasants or People's Crusade. It was led by Peter the Hermit and Walter Sans-Avoir and had no knowledge of or respect for the wishes of Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. The second wave was also not under the command of the emperor and was made up of a number of armies with their own commanders. Together, this group and the first wave numbered an estimated 60,000. The second wave was led by Hugh I, Count of Vermandois, the brother of King Philip I of France. Also among the second wave were Raymond of E, Count of Toulouse and the army of Provençals. It was this second wave of Crusaders which later passed through Asia Minor, captured Antioch in 1098 and finally took Jerusalem 15 July 1099. The third wave, composed of contingents from Lombardy, France, and Bavaria, arrived in Jerusalem in the early summer of 1101. Situation in Europe. At the western edge of Europe and of Islamic expansion, The Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula was well underway by the 11th century. It was intermittently ideological, as evidenced by the Codex Vigilanus compiled in 881. Increasingly in the 11th century, foreign knights, mostly from France, visited Iberia to assist the Christians in their efforts. Shortly before the First Crusade, Pope Urban II had encouraged the Iberian Christians to reconquer Tarragona, using much of the same symbolism and rhetoric that was later used to preach the Crusade to the people of Europe. The heart of Western Europe had been stabilized after the Christianization of the Saxon, Viking, and Hungarian peoples by the end of the 10th century. However, the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire gave rise to an entire class of warriors who now had little to do but fight among themselves. The random violence of the knightly class was regularly condemned by the Church, and in response it established the peace and truce of God to prohibit fighting on certain days of the year. At the same time, the reform-minded papacy came into conflict with the Holy Roman Emperors, resulting in the investiture controversy. Popes such as Gregory VII justified the subsequent warfare against the emperor's partisans in theological terms. It became acceptable for the Pope to utilize knights in the name of Christendom, not only against political enemies of the papacy, but also against Al-Andalus, or, theoretically, against the Seljuk dynasty in the east. To the east of Europe lay the Byzantine Empire, composed of Christians who had long followed a separate Orthodox rite. The Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches had been in schism since 1054. Historians have argued that the desire to impose Roman Church authority in the East may have been one of the goals of the Crusade, although Urban II, who launched the First Crusade, never refers to such a goal in his letters on crusading. The Seljuk Turks had taken over almost all of Anatolia after the Byzantine defeat of the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. However, their conquests were piecemeal and led by semi-independent warlords, rather than by the Sultan. A dramatic collapse of the empire's position on the eve of the Council of Clermont brought Byzantium to the brink of disaster. By the mid-1090s, the Byzantine Empire was largely confined to Balkan Europe and the northwestern fringe of Anatolia, and faced Norman enemies in the west as well as Turks in the east. In response to the defeat at Manzikert and subsequent Byzantine losses in Anatolia in 1074, Pope Gregory VII had called for the Milites Christi to go to Byzantium's aid. This call was largely ignored and even opposed. The reason for this was that while the defeat at Manzikert was shocking, it had limited significance and did not lead to major difficulties for the Byzantine Empire, at least in the short term. Situation in the Middle East. Until the Crusaders' arrival, the Byzantines had continually fought the Seljuks and other Turkish dynasties for control of Anatolia and Syria. The Seljuks, who were Orthodox Sunni Muslims, had formerly ruled the Great Seljuk Empire, but by the time of the First Crusade it had divided into several smaller states after the death of Malik Shah I in 1092. Malik Shah was succeeded in the Anatolian Sultanate of Rum by Khalid Arslan I, and in Syria by his brother Tutush I, who died in 1095. Tutush's sons Fakhal Mulk Rudwin and Dukuk inherited Aleppo and Damascus respectively, further dividing Syria amongst emirs antagonistic towards each other, as well as Kerbofa, the Artabig of Mosul. Egypt and much of Palestine were controlled by the Arab Shiite Fatimid Caliphate, which was significantly smaller since the arrival of the Seljuks. Warfare between the Fatimids and Seljuks caused great disruption for the local Christians and for Western pilgrims. The Fatimids, under the nominal rule of Caliph al-Mustali but actually controlled by Vizier al-Afd al-Shahanshah, had lost Jerusalem to the Seljuks in 1073. They recaptured it in 1098 from the Arturkids, a smaller Turkish tribe associated with the Seljuks, just before the arrival of the Crusaders. Historiography. It is now impossible to assess exactly why the First Crusade occurred, although many possible causes have been suggested by historians. Most recently J. Rubenstein. The historiography of the Crusades reflects attempts made by different historians to understand the Crusaders' complex causes and justifications. An early theory, the so-called Erdmann thesis, developed by German historian Karl Erdmann, directly linked the Crusades to the 11th century reform movements. This first theory claimed that the exportation of violence to the East and the assistance to the struggling Byzantine Empire were the Crusaders' primary goals, and that the conquest of Jerusalem was more a secondary, popular goal. Generally, subsequent historians have either followed Erdmann, with further expansions upon his thesis, or rejected it. Some historians, such as Speros Rewanus, have emphasized the influence of the rise of Islam generally, and the impact of the recent Seljuk onslaught specifically. Stephen Runciman argued that the Crusade was motivated by a combination of theological justification for holy war and of general restlessness and taste for adventure, especially among the Normans and the younger sons of the French nobility who had no other opportunities. Runciman even implies that there was no immediate threat from the Islamic world, arguing that, in the middle of the 11th century, the lot of the Christians in Palestine had seldom been so pleasant. However, Runciman makes his argument only in reference to Palestine under the Fatimids c. 1029–1073, not under the Seljuks. Moreover, the source of his generally positive view of Palestinian Christians' lot in the later 11th century is unclear, as there were very few contemporary Christian sources from Palestine writing in this period, and surviving Christian sources deriving directly from Seljuk Palestine are virtually non-existent. In opposition to Runciman's argument, and on the basis of contemporary Jewish Cairo Geniza documents, as well as later Muslim accounts, Moshe Gil argues that the Seljuk conquest and occupation of Palestine was a period of slaughter and vandalism, of economic hardship, and the uprooting of populations. Indeed, drawing upon earlier writers such as Ignatius of Melitna, Michael the Syrian had recorded that the Seljuks subjected Coel Syria and the Palestinian coast to cruel destruction and pillage. Thomas Asbridge argues that the First Crusade was Pope Urban II's attempt to expand the power of the Church and reunite the churches of Rome and Constantinople, which had been in schism since 1054. Asbridge, however, provides little evidence from Urban's own writings to bolster this claim, and Urban's 4 extant letters on crusading do not seem to express such a motive. According to Asbridge, the spread of Islam was unimportant because Islam and Christendom had coexisted for centuries in relative equanimity. Asbridge, however, fails to note that the recent Turkish conquest of Anatolia and southern Syria had shattered the tense but relatively stable balance of power that a somewhat revived Byzantine Empire had gradually developed with earlier Islamic powers over the course of the 10th and early 11th century. Following the defeat at Manzikert in 1071, Muslims had taken half of the Byzantine Empire's territory, and such strategically and religiously important cities as Antioch and Nicaea had only fallen to Muslims in the decade before the Council of Piacenza. Moreover, the harrowing accounts of the Turkish invasion and conquest of Anatolia recorded by such Eastern Christian chroniclers as John Skylitzes, Michael Italaites, Matthew of Edessa, Michael the Syrian and others, which are summarized by Vrewanus, seem to contradict Asbridge's broad picture of equanimous coexistence between the Christian and Muslim worlds in the second half of the 11th century. Thomas Madden represents a view almost diametrically opposed to that of Asbridge. While the Crusade was certainly linked to church reform and attempts to assert papal authority, he argues that it was most importantly a pious struggle to liberate fellow Christians, who, Madden claims, had suffered mightily at the hands of the Turks. This argument distinguishes the relatively recent violence and warfare that followed the conquest of the Turks from the general advance of Islam, the significance of which is dismissed by Runciman and Asbridge. Christopher Tyman incorporates both arguments in his thesis, namely, that the Crusade developed out of church reform and theories of holy war as much as it was a response to conflicts with the Islamic world throughout Europe and the Middle East. In Jonathan Riley Smith's view, poor harvests, overpopulation, and a pre-existing movement towards colonizing the frontier areas of Europe also contributed to the Crusade. However, he also takes care to say that most commentators then and a minority of historians now have maintained that the chief motivation was a genuine idealism. Peter Frankopan has argued that the First Crusade has been fundamentally distorted by the attention paid by historians to Western sources, rather than Greek, Syriac, Armenian, Arabic and Hebrew material from the late 11th and 12th centuries. The expedition to Jerusalem, he argues, was conceived of not by the Pope but by the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, in response to a dramatic deterioration of Byzantium's position in Asia Minor, and also as a result of the state of near anarchy at the imperial court, where plans to depose Alexios or even murder him were an open secret by 1094. The appeal to Pope Urban II was a desperate move to shore up emperor and empire. Frankopan goes further, showing that the Crusade's primary military targets in Asia Minor, Nicaea and Antioch, required large numbers of men with experience of siege warfare, precisely the sort recruited by Urban during his preaching in France in 1095–6. The idea that the Crusades were a response to Islam dates back as far as 12th century historian William of Tyre, who began his chronicle with the fall of Jerusalem to Umar. Although the original Islamic conquest had taken place centuries before the First Crusade, more recent events would have been fresh in the minds of the European Christians of the time. For example, in 1009 the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had been destroyed by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah. Pope Sergius IV supposedly called for a military expedition in response. And in France, many Jewish communities were even attacked in a misdirected retaliation. Despite the church's rebuilding after al-Hakim's death, and pilgrimages resuming, including the Great German Pilgrimage of 1064–1065, pilgrims continued to suffer attacks from local Muslims. In addition, the even more recent Turkish incursions into Anatolia and northern Syria were certainly viewed as devastating by Eastern Christian chroniclers, and it is plausible they were presented as such by the Byzantines to the Pope in order to solicit the aid of European Christians.